the fundamental question running through the history of political philosophy, the question of whether there's a natural and divine standard of morality, the question of whether there is, in reality, a law above us, or whether we are a law unto ourselves.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this continuing discussion that we're having with Dr. Ralph Hancock, who is a professor at BYU. He has been teaching political philosophy there at BYU since 1987. He holds degrees from both BYU and Harvard, has written multiple books, and I think most importantly is the father of 5 children and 18 grandchildren. Did I get that right?
That's the updated number, right?
That's the updated number. On the first one, I was reading some old stats. Well, it's great to have you on with us, Dr. Hancock, and it's a real pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you. I appreciate your interest.
So let's just get right into it. At this FAIR conference, I believe it was in 2013. Is that when it was?
I don't know. That sounds about right.
I think it was. So what was interesting about this is this was one of my first introductions to you, was watching this presentation. I'm going to link that below in the video here so that the listeners can watch your full presentation. I was blown away by it, mainly because of how prophetic it ended up turning out to be. So many of the things that you talked about in that conference back in 2013 have just seemed to, get bigger and bigger. And I think in some ways sort of help us to understand this crazy polarization that we're all seeing and experiencing both inside and outside of the church. And a lot of people in this kind of current environment that we're in, I've noticed that there's a lot of people within the church, especially, that have this attitude of like, oh no, politics, don't bring any of that political stuff into religion. And there's this wall they want to create, this impenetrable wall between I have my religious life, I have my spiritual life, and there's no, those don't touch each other. They have to be something separate. And you in that address argued that religion and politics are distinct, but they're never quite separate. What did you mean by that?
Now, let me comment first on this kind of anxiety about this, almost a psychological compulsion to keep these things separate. I just attended a very good Sunday school lesson, but both the teacher and a number of participants voiced this anxiety. That was their word, this anxiety about, and of course it's understandable. Our political world is in tumult. It's unpleasant in many respects. There are many things we'd like to avoid, but why is it that we feel so threatened? I think we would feel less threatened if we had just acknowledged that these things can never be completely separate, and it's part of being a Latter-day Saint and a good citizen and an intelligent person, just to sort things out as we go, with faith in Heavenly Father for the final sorting out of things. So in a way, I think our anxiety arises from this illusion that we keep pursuing, that we can be neutral politically, considering ourselves as Latter-day Saints or from a religious standpoint. And there's a simple reason this can't work. But first of all, I mean, in a certain way, the impulse to keep things separate is a natural, a worthy impulse, and one that's embedded in our American political culture, which involves a certain degree of separation between church and state, as Thomas Jefferson said, and we keep saying. So a degree of separation is built into our institutions and therefore into the way we tend, as it were, naturally to approach these things. And from a religious standpoint, we should start there. Obviously, politics is not the most important thing. the most important things are in God's hand and are mediated through the institutions and the texts, the scriptures that he gives to us. And that should be where our trust lies. We should not put our trust in the arm of flesh.
Mm-hmm.
So we should be working from a place of peace and trust in our souls, based upon our faith that Heavenly Father is in charge, and that we already know the end of the story and who wins.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's the separation side. Taking things, I could approach it from the political point of view.
Well, real quick, before you go into that, just to kind of sum that up. So essentially, the idea is on the separation side, keeping them separate, is that there are people, and I've seen this in my own family, that there are those who become so obsessed with the political realm, it's as if all of eternity rests on who wins the next election. And
Right.
it's this. So what you're saying, if I'm understanding correctly, is that we need to be careful we don't hyperventilate about politics. There needs to be a level that we understand that, look, don't let politics consume every fiber of your being.
Right.
Because that is not a healthy way to live. So there is a degree to which that sort of separation is understandable. Am I understanding right? Is that a fair
That's right. But then that can be taken to the extreme of imagining that we can all be Latter-day Saints together, and the questions that come to a head in the political world don't need to touch us and are irrelevant to our religious community. That's also false.
Mm-hmm.
That's also false. I think an example might be helpful. So let's take the example of homosexual marriage.
Mm-hmm.
The church has always taught and still very clearly teaches, consider the Proclamation on the Family notably, that, to say it abruptly, homosexual marriage is not real marriage ordained by God or by nature. That's the way I would say it.
Mm-hmm.
The church took active measures and mobilized support in California, for example, for an initiative that was against homosexual marriage. Then when homosexual marriage became the law of the land, following a Supreme Court case, then the church essentially said, well, that's the law of the land, and we will not dispute the law of the land. But that doesn't, so let's go back to as if we were talking before all of these matters were, I would say, provisionally settled for the United States of America in favor of homosexual marriage. You and I, assuming we're having this conversation 10 years ago, you and I might be on different sides of that question, whether it makes sense politically, civically, you might say, for the United States to recognize homosexual marriage. My opinion would be no. Maybe let's just posit that you or someone like you, your opinion would be, yes, we both agree on the Family Proclamation, but it's a separate question how we are going to work things out and manage, because our nation is not a church and will not be governed by the doctrines of the church or by the hierarchy of the church. So we have to work out all that separately. And there are many fine practical questions involved in deciding what the best law and policy is on this question for us now. Or, maybe a softer example, more digestible one would be prohibition. Mm-hmm. We think that people should abstain from alcohol, and the government tried to impose that and it didn't work, and we could argue about all that. But those are separate questions, whether we should
Yeah.
prohibit or whether the government should prohibit.
Yeah, the difference of is what is moral or not is a separate question for what should or should not be legal, right? I may think that something is immoral, but I don't want to necessarily create legislation to
Even, I mean,
enforce that.
Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologia recognizes this in his treatise on law, recognizes this very clearly. It's a separate question what God's law is and what it makes sense to try to implement at a given place and time for a given people.
But would you say, and this is where I approach it, would you say that itself is a religious supposition? The idea, I always say, my religion teaches that I'm not supposed to use the force of the state to impose my will on other people. Historically, that wasn't necessarily in all human societies. That isn't necessarily a universal. It is a religious supposition or a moral supposition, at least in the realm of that, to say, yeah, I don't believe that I should use the power of the state to impose my views on other people. And so it's kind of weird to me. It's kind of like keep religion out of politics, sort of like, but religion is the reason that I'm not imposing my will on other people through the state.
Yes, well, recognizing agency and giving people latitude to make their own choices, it does have a religious foundation. But I'm going to, maybe we'll part ways here, but I'm going to take some exception to this, because if you adopt that as what you just said, as an absolute and comprehensive principle, then you end up believing that the state can be neutral and does not, that laws and policies that it imposes by legal penalties have no moral foundation or moral presupposition or moral bias. Now, that's just false.
And I agree. I think you can take that to way too far of an extreme, and it's finding that balance that's really important. Right. And ultimately, though, what we're talking about here is the concept of justice. And if we're going to be neutral politically, but if politics is fundamentally about what is just and what is not just, I have a hard time reconciling that.
So no neutrality is possible, but I think you used the word separate just a moment ago, and I would fall back on my word distinct. The distinction is important, but morality and politics will never be completely separate. And therefore, we can't simply say that, we can't clarify things by saying that we have no right. We may believe in a morality, but we have no right to impose it. If I may say, I guess I'll be abrupt and shocking here. No, that's not the question. The question is always going to be which morality to impose and how much.
Yes, I agree. And that is the question.
A challenging, practical question. I think President Oakes has written more than once that against the idea that dismisses religious influence on law by saying you can't legislate morality. I believe he has said and written, you never legislate anything but morality. There's always a morality involved in the whole legal system, the whole legal regime.
Well, and you had said in your address, one of the quotes that I took away from it that was so powerful, you said that every political order, at least implicitly, holds something to be sacred. And I was like, whoa, that's super true.
Bingo. Is that not true? I mean, what is sacred is much contested, but however things shake out, one or another idea of what is sacred, what is untouchable, what is inviolable, what we don't question will win out. The woke, notably, conspicuously, have their own idea of what is sacred, a certain anthropology, a certain view of human nature, a certain view of the meaning of human existence, which is bound up with choosing one's own identity and a kind of absolute idea of freedom of self-expression, combined incoherently with ideas of solidarity, of identity groups and so forth. Anyway, the woke have their own religion,
Yep.
their own idea of what is ultimate and sacred. But
Well,
this would, but that maybe that's too obvious. I would say even New Deal liberalism, to go back a few decades to a more moderate, to our sensibilities now today, form of liberalism. New Deal liberalism itself is like every political perspective or movement is bound up with certain assumptions about human nature and a good human life.
and
Yeah.
going back to that idea of something being sacred, you can look at anyone's political philosophy, and maybe people don't understand this implicitly or explicitly, but they implicitly are holding something to be sacred. And so I think because it's from that sacred center that their political ideas emerge, right? And so
Yeah.
I think an interesting thing to do with any political ideology is to try and drill into it and understand it, to figure out what is that thing they're holding sacred, and do I think that is something that is truly sacred? And if it isn't, well, then, I mean, for a Latter-day Saint, like, we have very specific things that we hold as sacred. And so there should be a dividing line between us and other people. Now, granted, there's going to be different conceptions as to the nature of the sacred within Latter-day Saints. So there's going to be some leeway, but there are certain ideas that are just not congruent with what we hold to be sacred.
That's right. So if we go back to our hypothetical conversation 10 years ago, when the legal regime of homosexual marriage was an open question, and we're talking in Sunday school class or in the foyer afterwards, we have to be aware that we might want to say, well, you're enthusiastic about gay marriage and I am opposed to it, but it doesn't matter because that's all political and we share the same. Well, you see, but the political is obviously leaking into our, or possibly invading our religious space. I would say invading more and more our religious space because the political view is bound up with a certain understanding of the meaning of human existence. If you're enthusiastic about homosexual marriage, that's a different view of eternity than mine, or I would be ready to argue than any view compatible with foundational Latter-day Saint beliefs. So we have to be alert to this intrusion, this leakage, or even this invasion of a, what shall I call it? I called it a theoretical liberalism in my talk, of a rationalistic, humanistic, finally liberationist, a radically human autonomy centered view of human nature and the human condition that is a very dominant view now in the political sphere. We have to be aware of that leaking into and even invading our religious space. And we can't be neutral about that. It would be nice just to agree to disagree, and just as a matter of civility and managing our social and religious existence, sometimes we just do that when we see it's not fruitful to try to talk about it. But fundamentally, the issue has to be confronted. The issue between the fundamental view of the sacred or of ultimate human meaning that is at work in our religion, and there's always much to discuss in defining that, or the fundamental view that is increasingly dominant, aggressive, invasive in the secular so-called world.
So I heard there's a phrase that goes on. People say it all the time, that politics is downstream from culture, and I think that is an astute observation. But I would even say, go a step further. Well, where does culture come from? And culture, as far as I can tell, comes from the word I would use is religion, but I mean it in a much more broad sense, sort of these fundamental axioms that people have adopted and accept as sort of their worldview. That's another way of putting it, maybe. That from these worldviews come the culture, and from the culture come the politics. And so when we are sort of disengaging from any sort of political discussion, because anything that has a political tinge to it, well, everything politically ultimately could, will largely will root back to these fundamental things that people hold sacred as their sort of sacred worldview, the things in life that they, from which emerge their behavior and their attitudes and their moral value judgments. And so for us to be disconnected from that fight and to say, oh, well, those are political matters, we don't, it's like, well, I've had a hard time with it. Something just kind of to go off for a second. I've had a really hard time with it because people will say, like, even in groups I participate in online, they'll say, oh, well, this is political. We don't talk about political things in this gospel forum. And it's like, and we're talking about like gay marriage or something like, it's like, you guys, these are fundamental moral questions. And you're saying we can't talk about them, not because they're not religious, but because politics has, as you've said, invaded the political space. And now you guys want to just shut your mouths and say, oh, well, this is off limits now because now they're talking about this. And, the political figures are talking about this, so we can't talk about it. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, that's a good way of framing the problem. I would revise your picture of the downstream religion, culture, and politics a bit. And this, I've had this disagreement with friends, fellow intellectual conservatives, because there's something missing in this picture. In a way, human agency, as it expresses itself, especially in the political realm, is left out of this picture if we assume that, there's just like religion is a given, and that produces culture, which is a given, at least in relation to what it produces, namely politics. Here's what's wrong with this picture. And this actually relates to questions that are alive here, but especially in France, about immigration and Islam in relation to a secular republic and so forth. What's left out of this picture is that politics in the most capacious, comprehensive sense that interests political philosophers. Mm-hmm. Politics plays a productive, I would almost say a creative role in determining just what our culture, dare I say, even our religion means. It's always in play because it's in the political realm where the rubber of our practical life is actually meeting the road, and we're having to commit ourselves to the actual practical meaning of these broad principles we have. So
that's a good point. So real quick, just to, again, make sure I understand, because I think I see where you're going, and I actually agree with you 100%. Yeah. The thing is that these aren't totally disconnected from each other, because like I use this as, I think an example can show it. The change in public opinion since gay marriage was legalized has been stunning. I mean, in 2008, California couldn't even get a popular vote to vote in favor of gay marriage. And then within just a matter of years, it is totally accepted. Now, whether a person agrees with that or not, I think what I saw is once the government endorsed it, society said, this is what we as a society accept.
Part of morality always involves authority, and government is an authority. Mm-hmm. Government represents the presumptive crystallization of publicly held authoritative norms. Now, by the way, I have to say the amazingly fast change of opinion, public opinion on the question of homosexual marriage shouldn't necessarily increase our faith in democracy. The fact that what counts as democratic one year can be the opposite of what counts as democratic the next year, is that, unless we have some like completely mystical blind faith in progress, that should be enough to unsettle us about the validity of democracy as an ultimate standard. But the very fact that, Barack Obama was first elected, was it 2008?
Yep.
During that first campaign, he was ready, he was willing to say, only God can search hearts, but he certainly said that marriage is meant to be between a man and a woman. But it didn't. But a few years later, that was you might.
Now we don't even know what a man and a woman is, and we're debating that.
You'd have to be a troglodyte to believe that. Now, but what Barack Obama believed 12 years ago or something, So,
but doesn't this all kind of tie back in, and again, to kind of move on into some other things you hit in the talk? Doesn't this have to do with sort of this moral relativism that we're seeing in society? And what role do you see sort of moral relativism playing as in the current environment and these changes that we're seeing?
Well, moral relativism is a convenient concept. I've resorted to it very often. The idea that every individual or every group or every historical period or every culture, there's cultural, historical relativism, or sort of individualistic moral relativism. But in every case, the idea is that morality is relative to a person or group or culture, and that there is no higher ground in God or in nature. That morality is ultimately a human construction. That's what's at stake. Well, it's often objected that what I'm calling relativistic is not really relativistic, because the people involved are actually moralistic. They're even crusaders, and they're quite willing to impose their morality. Well, this seems like a contradiction, but in a way, these are two sides of the same coin. Relativism is paradoxically its own morality, or serves its own morality. The relativism always applies to other people's morality. We want to relativize their morality so that we can impose our own.
Doesn't that, and that's just, in my mind, that's just a Hobbesian world. That's just power and preference, and we duke it out for whoever holds the power and gets to impose their preference on others. That's the way I view it, and I have a very hard time getting around that. If you remove any notion of moral truth, that there are right and wrong answers to moral questions, regardless of our perspective, I just don't see how that gets reconciled in any other way, except for to say, yeah, we're all just competing for power. And you logically, in my opinion, move into postmodernism with that.
Right. Well, we're all moralistic and postmodern Hobbesians now. Sure, except those of us who work very hard to avoid falling into that.
Those who are logically inconsistent. Those who say, "Oh, well, I'm not a postmodernist, but I don't believe that there's any moral order." I have a very hard time understanding how that works. Now that's a little bit of a side thing, but you talk in your talk specifically about this idea of theoretical liberalism, and that it derives its premises from the radical beginnings of modern thought, with the idea, kind of the core of what we'll call the new liberalism, which is manifest in the woke movement, all this kind of stuff. If I'm not mistaken, your idea here is that their kind of central tenet or philosophy that kind of guides all of it is that ultimately there is no authority above that of a human being.
Exactly right. That's the premise of the theoretical premise of liberalism and of the mainstream or hardcore of the Enlightenment. set the Scottish Enlightenment aside as having a more moderate temper and disposition towards religion and tradition and so forth. But the mainstream of the Enlightenment, you cited Thomas Hobbes, so in a way is based on a very Hobbesian foundation, the substance of which is that there is no morality but what human beings create. And yet somehow this relativistic premise gets translated into an idealistic and morally authoritative mindset or sensibility. Human beings create morality, and so you have to follow ours. You know, Hobbes had one version of it. Our woke progressives have their own today. So that's a contradiction that lies at the heart of modern rationalism. Once again, modern rationalism cannot account for its own moral substance. So my point in distinguishing theoretical from practical liberalism in that talk, in a way, I'm addressing certain conservatives such as Patrick Deneen of Notre Dame, who argue that the jig is up with liberal democracy as a whole because liberalism is corrupt, is fatally flawed, is radically humanistic, as we've described, from its origins. And I'm conceding half the point and saying, as a theoretical system, and it's not merely a matter of theoretical interest, because a theoretical system has legs and has impact.
Mm-hmm.
As a theoretical system, critiques like those of Patrick Deneen are valid. Leo Strauss, I think, already showed this 60 or 70 years ago, that the premises of modern liberalism are unstable and self-radicalizing. So Leo Strauss tells a story of three waves of modernity. You could say Hobbes' wave, Rousseau's wave, Nietzsche's wave. I won't go into the details, but the point is that that modern rational liberalism is unstable and self-radicalizing, and Patrick Deneen is right that those foundations are exhausted. That's why I distinguish practical liberalism, the liberalism of the American founding, the liberalism of a healthy American republic, described by Tocqueville, and still somewhat, present in various ways. We have to hope still today, but throughout the contemporary period. But the practical liberalism is a liberalism that it's not an absolute theoretical doctrine. It's a liberalism that implicitly recognizes its dependency upon moral, religious, and familial foundations that it cannot itself create. A moderate liberalism with conservative elements.
Yeah. So we might, and again, just so everyone who's listening, who's hearing a lot of the talk about liberalism and maybe have certain ideas about what that means, liberalism in the sense that we're talking about it here is the classic sense of liberalism, of the idea of liberty. And specifically within that, I think what you're saying, if I'm not mistaken, is that the American founding very much had a view of liberty, but it had this religious foundation where if we compare that maybe with the French Revolution, which said, let's have liberty without any sort of religious sort of foundation or constraints. And those two, we kind of ran those two experiments and we kind of saw what happened. That you're saying that that theoretical liberalism that we see today is perhaps much more akin to what was going on in the French Revolution, with radical notions of liberation instead of sort of the traditional liberalism that came through the American founding, which, George Washington and John Adams obviously were very, very big on the absolute necessity of sort of this social fabric built up in morality. Is that what would you correct about that, or is that fair?
Well, I think on the whole, it's you make a good point, and the comparison is ever valid and useful between the American and French revolutions. Your viewers can find writings of mine on this subject probably on my website. But yes, the key, I can cite Tocqueville here. Tocqueville, in his Introduction to Democracy in America, a brilliant 15 pages, a gem all its own, I would say. In this introduction, Tocqueville says that the genius of America is its capacity to hold together the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom. And in saying that, he obviously has in mind a contrast with the French Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Now, just how it holds together, to what degree it holds together, what degree of separation is part of the holding together, that's a very fine and complex topic in Tocqueville. But the essential point is that America is liberal in a way that is respectful of and is actually contained by, you might say, overseen by, supervised by religion.
Yeah,
Like a fundamental, Christian consensus.
So just to contrast the two, so when we're talking about sort of the new liberalism versus sort of your, I guess we'll call it conservative liberalism, maybe we could call it that.
Sure.
I probably would do that. Is this notion that one of them is anchored in that rights transcend God or transcend man and ultimately come from God, that there is an idea here that human beings are not the ultimate authority and that morality exists as an objective truth. There is objective moral truth, whereas the new liberalism says, no, there is no objective moral standards. Man is the measure of all things, and therefore the greatest good, the thing that they hold sacred, is individual self-expression.
Right, which wouldn't be quite the case with the French Revolution, but that would, to sort out the difference between French radicalism and our French revolutionary radicalism and our contemporary, that would be another topic. I would be happy.
Yeah, and I know that there's a lot of nuances to some of these things. So one thing, when we talk about the new liberalism, why is it that you don't use the term progressivism? Because right now there's a big discussion, at least in my generation of conservatives, where we're making this distinction. We're kind of like, liberals are our friends. We don't necessarily have a problem with liberals. We have a problem with progressives or the woke, kind of that side of it. And so is there a reason that you call it the new liberalism? Or are those synonymous? What's kind of is there any distinction?
I would say two things. First of all, if I were giving the talk, moving the wrong way. Sorry. If I were giving that talk today, there might be reason to adopt the vocabulary of progressivism. That distinction between liberals and progressives is more marked today. I mean, happily, some, I could almost say old-fashioned liberals are peeling off and saying, wait a minute, this is crazy.
Yep.
I mean, it's their fault. It's their fault it's crazy, but it's...
I've heard it phrased right now that what's actually going on is not a battle between conservatives and liberals. It's a battle within liberalism, that the liberals need to stand up to the progressives, and they're not. And that a lot of them are caving to this progressive sort of, like you're saying, this new liberalism. But like you're saying, there are others. And it's really funny because it's making some really strange bedfellows where all of a sudden you have conservatives out there championing, sharing Bill Maher videos because they see that this has gone off the rails.
Well, look, I applaud liberals like Bill Maher for objecting to rank nonsense on the further left. I would say that, and this follows from premises we've laid down earlier. I would say that the liberals cannot save themselves from the progressives without falling back on some conservative elements. It really is a middle ground that doesn't hold. But in any case, if I were giving the talk today, I might use another vocabulary. But that said, it's important to see, and this is the point I was just making, that liberalism in its theoretical foundations is implicated in progressivism or wokeism and so forth.
I see. Now, there was another quote here that I'll share from your talk. You said that I have learned a significant number of LDS who consider themselves and would like to be considered faithful are ready to discount the authority of the family proclamation and to subordinate it to the new liberalism. That they have adopted this, that they have adopted as a moral touchstone. For them, a practically self-evident syllogism dictates this discounting of the proclamation's teachings. And this is the syllogism that you give. You said, the church teaches moral truth. The new liberalism, equality, progress, sexual freedom, defines moral truth. Ergo, what the church really teaches, or must one day teach, is the new liberalism. What did you mean by that?
It's true, isn't it? I mean, this is really the comprehensive example of the invasion of our religious space by political, by moral, a moral viewpoint, a moral anthropology, really, that is spawned in the political, ideological, activist world. So we can't avoid weaving together. We can't avoid seeking a synthesis or achieving the integrity between our ultimate moral and religious beliefs. Now, you see, I'm going to come back to the question of the upstream from politics. Do we find culture upstream and religion from that? It's a little more complicated, and here I may disturb or confuse some people because, in a sense, even at the highest level, our nature as political beings, Aristotle put it that way, and I'm an Aristotelian in this sense, in our political natures, we work out the meaning of morality in practice in our communities and deliberation with others. So if in the political side of our nature, which is necessarily a very important, to say the least, a side that always bids to be authoritative, this side where we're working out and reconciling our ideas with our authoritative political community. If in that community, first of all, it's inevitable that working out through our agency as political beings, it's inevitable that color, that shade into, or that seek synthesis with our fundamental religious beliefs. They're not separate. So in a way, I'm suggesting that at the top of this chain is something that's both religious and political.
I see. And maybe it's less of a, it's more of a circle rather than a straight line. Whereas the political also is where what you're saying is where we actually put into practice our religious principles. It's
a circle. It's a dialectic, right? It's a point. Well, we're convinced, we have convinced ourselves in our political deliberations that these things are fundamental. Do those square? How do they square with our fundamental religious beliefs? But they can't always be squared. And the example you've just given shows this to be true. But it's inevitable. We can't say that it's just incoherent to say that in the political world, I hold these fundamental beliefs about the meaning of human existence and the ultimate moral principles, and yet religiously, no, they're always going. If we don't work out the relationship and sort things out and decide how much our religious views are here and now politically applicable and in what way, then we are opening the door to the invasion, because it's knocking at the door one way or another.
Yeah, we're
It's
just
there.
we're just ceding the ground. We're just retreating and saying, yeah, we're not going to be in this space, and then others with their ideas
Yeah.
occupy it.
If we
Because
say that somebody's politically right, we're led to say that they're morally right, and then say, well, morally you're right, but I follow the prophet. That's not a coherent viewpoint.
yeah,
That's not
yeah,
going to
no,
work. Yeah.
it definitely isn't. And so, in other words, well, I guess I've thought of it this way, and you can tell me what you think about this. At the end of the day, everyone is bringing their religious viewpoint, their things that they hold sacred, to the political arena. Who am I going to vote for? What am I going to do in regards to whatever policy? Am I going to support this or that? The way that you reason through that is through the lens of what you value, of what's sacred to you, of what's right and wrong.
And vice versa, as we just established.
Exactly.
Your idea of the sacred is being refined, modified, articulated, ramified in its implications in the political, in the very broad sense. You may think you have no interest in politics, but you're talking to neighbors. You're figuring out your relationship to the community. You're watching TV.
Mm-hmm.
You are part of a larger community with a politically authorized authority behind it. And all those notions have to be engaged with what you believe religiously. They're not going away. You have to work it out.
Yeah, and I oftentimes think of the famous quote by Elder Ezra Taft Benson, where he talks about the world works from the outside in. Christ works from the inside out. Christ would basically change men who would then go and change their external environment. And so it's working on that more fundamental level.
Yeah.
And I think that, but what you're saying as well is that the environment that we are in also affects us.
The inward has to be considered the most fundamental level, but there's always a dialogue with the outward. And really, one can see the problem just by drawing this paradox from the very fine Ezra Taft Benson example that you just cited. It is a fundamental political teaching of the Marxist left, which is very much an influence on the woke left, the progressive woke left today. The fundamental political teaching is that it's all from the outside. That goes back to Rousseau.
Yeah. So everything is a social construction.
Right. And that there's some secret, innocent self that lies deep in every individual human being. And all the problems come from just a bad social arrangement, not individual moral responsibility. But the paradox is that is a political teaching which arises from, which emanates from our political discourse and our authoritative political institutions, so that the inside is necessarily, even the protection of the inside involves an awareness of this view of morality that is increasingly ascendant in the social, political, ideological world, that reverses the order of the inside and the outside, the soul or the spirit and the institutions, if I may put it that way.
So moving on to another quote that you said when it comes to us as Latter-day Saints and kind of the environment in which we're engaging in this sort of cultural battle that's going on right now. You had said something along these lines. You said Mormon apologetics aims not to replace faith, prayer, and obedience as essential to the pursuit of ultimate life-giving truth, but to preserve or create a cultural and intellectual climate in which belief may flourish. And I believe there you're relying on Austin Farrer, who was quoted by Elder Maxwell, who had said something very similar. But you said today, one of the greatest obstacles to such a climate, this climate of belief, is the cultural prestige of the new liberalism, or what we might call progressivism or wokeism, or however we might put that in its manifestations, with its denial of any moral authority above human self-expression. So why would you say that this idea of the new liberalism is one of the greatest obstacles to a climate of belief and gospel living?
Because it presupposes an idea of the sacred, a moral anthropology, as you've heard me say, a view of human nature and human meaning, which is incompatible with any conceivable interpretation of the foundations of the gospel or of Christianity.
Such as? What are some of the most specific ones?
Here we can, let's use a recent example here, because many of your viewers will be aware of the talk that Elder Holland gave at BYU in the beginning of the year, the academic year BYU conference. That would be last August. And the response to it, well, in the talk, he was very plain about BYU not being progressive or woke, and especially plain about teachings on the family. Does he mention the family proclamation by name? I don't recall, but certainly on traditional morality surrounding the family and chastity being an uncompromisable teaching that must be safeguarded at BYU. Now, you'll be aware of the response to this. And by the way, you can read me at Public Square magazine on this topic and listen to me on the Quick podcast. But the response, and why not name names? I mean, they come out in public, right? And why should they not be named when being criticized in public? So representative of the reaction against Elder Holland was a Faith Matters podcast featuring Patrick Mason and Tom Christofferson. And essentially both of them, the interviewers at Faith Matters very much going along with them, both of them essentially adopted a view of the sacred, a deep moral standpoint, which was grounded in the inviolability of the individual and his or her, supply me the other pronouns, I don't know them, his or her feelings or sense of pain. So Tom Christofferson, I think it was, for example, and these are good men who want to support the church and are trying to find a way for it, but I think they're fundamentally wrong. And so I'm naming them and trying to name what is fundamentally wrong in what they're saying.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was going to say, and that is, I recently saw Patrick Mason posted on a book that recently came out called Queer Theology, and how it's a fantastic book. Everyone needs to read it, and kind of putting it out there as this excellent work of theology. And he, even in that interview, was talking about people blazing the way for a new 1978 style revelation because they're doing the theological work. And I'm just like, you guys, the theological work on this has been done. It's like, we don't, I don't know what there is to argue. And so anyway, from my perspective, I'm looking at this and it's exactly what you're saying. For these people, they have a worldview that somewhere deep down, whether they even recognize it, explicitly, from my point of view, and this is me talking here, that they have adopted the new liberalism, this idea that the human self is ultimately what determines moral questions, at least when it comes to these matters. and they have adopted that, and that now is the way that the church needs to be.
Exactly, and you can see how this argument, how this deep moral premise of the new liberalism or progressivism or wokeism is at work in the response to Elder Holland, because they do their best to say, we love Elder Holland, we know he loves us and the church, and he's doing his best. But what he doesn't seem to understand is that we know people who are pained. We know people whose self-expression is blunted, is impeded by this way of talking. And that can't possibly be right, because we know the sacred principle is my feelings and my self-expression and my sense of my own identity. Those are ultimate truths. Well, if those are ultimate truths, we should start over with different scriptures and a different.
Yes, because
It's
that
a
is not
fundamentally different foundation. And
Mhm.
Patrick Mason, I have to say, I mean, when in response to my criticisms or others like mine, he will fall back and say, well, I'm just, as a historian, I'm just describing some possibilities that are out there, or what the facts on the ground are. But no, please, as you just cited, his hope lies in blazing a trail towards a new interpretation of the gospel that is consistent with the secret self as the foundation of all meaning.
Yeah, and he would, if he was standing here next to us, I'm sure he would disagree with that. And I would say, wonderful. I'd love to get you in here. Maybe all three of us could have a conversation. I would love to do that. So Patrick or Tom or any of you guys, if you're listening and we bring you up, you're always welcome to come on here and discuss this yourself. But I have to say, I'm with you, Ralph. It seems like people are hiding the ball on this, that they, oh, well, we're not really, I don't really want there to be a big change in our church and all. It's like, come on, all of your actions manifest that this is what you want. And why won't you just be honest and say, I want for this policy in the church to change because I do not feel that homosexual behavior is sinful. I don't. Therefore,
Bingo.
and just be honest and own it.
Bingo.
It's the cloak and dagger stuff that really just kind of seems disingenuous to me.
You remind me, you brought up Hobbes, the 17th century, the great English philosopher, in a way, not a liberal, but a founder of liberalism, because there's a delicious passage where in the conclusion to one of the parts of his Leviathan, I think, he alludes to the question that has been raised, whether what he's trying to do is to reform the whole teaching of the universities and therefore the church and the priesthood, and replace it with another complete moral education. And you know how he answers? He says, look, anyone who watches what I do can clearly discern what it is I think.
Yes.
Just so, yeah, watch what they do.
Yes, and ultimately, to kind of wrap this up, and I think to kind of frame all of this that we've talked about, is this notion that you have two different moral views of the world. One says that man is the measure of all things. Everything is a social construction, but, and then the other is to say, no, there is a God and there is we don't even necessarily need to go that deep. It's just the idea that there is moral truth, that there are
There's
right
God,
and wrong.
there's nature, there's a moral reality.
Yeah. Yes, there's a moral reality. And and we have to conform ourselves to align with that moral reality. And that is the deeper question here that I don't think a lot of people see. And so as young Latter-day Saints are navigating these, polarizing times, and everyone's saying, oh, well, we don't want conflict. We don't want any, contention. What advice would you give to young Latter-day Saints who want to stay faithful to the faith in these polarizing times?
Well, you've just given excellent advice, and I'm going to try to draw it out, make it a little more explicit in a certain respect. And that is just to say that the question that presents itself to you is between the church and the world, or the certain authoritative teachings based upon revelation and faith on the one hand, and what the world presents and pretends to be. What does it pretend? The product, I don't know, of reason, of democracy, of progress, of what doesn't need religion.
Mm-hmm.
But what is the ground of all that alternative? I would say beneath this question that immediately engages you and in which you are caught up, the question between your religion and the world, beneath that is precisely the question, which is the fundamental question running through the history of political philosophy, the question of whether there's a natural and divine standard of morality, the question of whether there is, in reality, a law above us, or whether we are a law unto ourselves. Well, I invite you, young and not so young viewers, to ask the questions. What makes it more rational to assert that there's no law, no reality, divine or natural, higher than the human mind or than human desires or human will? Because it really all comes down to will, as Nietzsche perfectly understood. The upshot of this modern viewpoint is the will to power. There is nothing but the will to self-creation, which always involves the imposition of will and power on others. So there's nothing. Religion is on the side of rationality, because rationality acknowledges the reality of limits to human will. And the assertion that underlies, and it hides the ball often, and you have to dig down deep to see this underlying proposition. But the underlying proposition, hidden by idealism, by progress, by compassion, even by a bastardized notion of love, the reality underlying these smokescreens is the proposition that human beings make themselves and make their own meaning to go along with it, that there's nothing above the human will. What makes that rational? Why should you be intimidated by the supposed rationality of that viewpoint? I invite you not to be intimidated by that viewpoint. And political philosophy, the best use of political philosophy is to teach us not to be intimidated by rationality as will to power. Excellent.
Well, I think we've covered pretty much everything that I wanted to cover in this.
That's pretty much the meaning of all things there. So
exactly. Well, that was a great note to end on. And Dr. Hancock, I want to just thank you again for coming on. It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure as well. Thank you, Jacob.
If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, if you want more content, including the podcast, go to thoughtful-faith.com. Thanks for watching.